not known, and we had intel
understood,
intel
Secretary,
were not known, and then those were fortified with bunkers and other fortifications with theater air defenses. Was our concern that something could
I'm going to pause you there. I'm going to give you a chance.
Absolutely.
Secretary, I'm going to
You're
give you a chance.
disparaging me that I don't care.
I'm asking you whether you think they're liars or not. That's what I asked you.
You are disparaging me that I don't care about the passing of our troops.
Nope. I asked if you thought they're liars, Secretary.
That's disparaging and smearing in every way. Nobody cares more about the fate of our troops. Nobody cares about the health of our troops. Nobody wants to bring them all hope more than I do.
I understand, but he controls the time. He controls the time.
6 American soldiers are dead. Dozens more are wounded. And when Representative Chris Deluzio asked Secretary Pete Hegseth a simple question, Secretary Pete Hegseth couldn't answer it. Watch what happens when Representative Chris Deluzio corners Secretary Pete Hegseth live in front of the entire country.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Deluzio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We all just heard pretty powerful reporting, courtesy of Mr. Ryan, from many of our wounded troops who were injured in the attack in Kuwait. Mr. Secretary, you heard direct quotes from some of them via CBS's reporting. They were willing to talk to the press. Things like they were unprepared to provide any defense for themselves in the unit. Things like we were moved closer to Iran to a deeply unsafe area that was a known target. Your spokesperson, Sean Parnell, in response to that reporting, said it was not true. Do you agree with that? He was calling these guys liars?
I'm not calling our troops liars, and I don't know if what you're representing is correct or not. I'll take you at your word on that. But all I know is that we took every effort possible at the commencement of this campaign to ensure the defense of our troops, to include moving them off of known bases to places that were not known, and we had intel
understood,
intel
Secretary,
were not known, and then those were fortified with bunkers and other fortifications with theater air defenses. Was our concern that something could
I'm going to pause you there. I'm going to give you a chance.
Absolutely.
Secretary, I'm going to
You're
give you a chance.
disparaging me that I don't care.
I'm asking you whether you think they're liars or not. That's what I asked you.
You are disparaging me that I don't care about the passing of our troops.
Nope. I asked if you thought they're liars. Secretary.
That's disparaging and smearing in every way. Nobody cares more about the fate of our troops. Nobody cares about the health of our troops. Nobody wants to bring them all hope more than I do.
I understand, but he controls the time. He controls the time. You get to control your answer. And the gentleman's ready.
If we're allowed to answer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Secretary, my question was clear, whether you thought they were liars or not. You don't seem to want to answer it. We can move on. The other part of what your spokesman said, and you just reiterated here, was that, and I'm quoting your spokesman, every possible measure has been taken to safeguard our troops, end quote. You mean to tell us, and I'll give you a chance to clarify, there is not a single additional thing you could have done to protect those troops who are now wounded, 6 of whom are dead?
I'm telling you that as a department, we did every conceivable thing at my level and every echelon down to ensure the maximum force protection for our troops. We live in a dangerous world, in a dangerous place against a determined enemy that can't have a nuclear weapon, and that requires sacrifice and risk. And it tragically, in this case, it meant 6 Americans lost their lives and others were wounded. And we all know that, and that's part of the cost. But it does not mean we didn't care. It doesn't mean we didn't commit.
I didn't ask you that,
It doesn't mean we didn't do
saying
everything possible, which we did.
But let's be clear about what was done. There were T-walls there, essentially. There was no overhead protection. The known threat in that environment, and I think we all here understand it, is overhead drone strike. There was no protection for overhead drone strike. So I'm struggling to understand how your answer and your spokesman's answer is that every possible measure was taken. We can move on. Mr. Chairman, Chairman Kane, I want to ask you something on a different topic. Folks at home know you're the senior military officer in our armed services. They may not have as much of understanding of your role in the chain of command. You're outside the operational chain of command, but you are the President's and the Secretary's senior military advisor. So I want to ask a very basic thing, what you would expect our commanders in the field, our troops to do should the enemy lay down their weapons and try to surrender. What would you expect commanders in the field to do?
Well, sir, I think I'll go back to something I said earlier with deep respect for your question, but I think you're trying to take me to a partisan place here, and I can't let you do that.
General, as always, I respect your desire to avoid it. I'm not trying to put you in a partisan place.
And I know that, but our officers and enlisted service members always follow lawful orders. There's a checklist for them to do that, and I'll stay in the middle.
Very good. Understood, General. Secretary, let me give you a chance. And you've been asked about this earlier. You said in, I think, your press conference, essentially, and I'll quote you here, no quarter, no mercy for our enemies. That's the end of the quote. Is your guidance that you expect our troops in harm's way, if there's a foreign enemy surrendering, laying down their arms, they're supposed to provide no quarter and kill them?
You denied it, but you were indeed trying to take the chairman to a partisan place. That was General Milley. That was the previous administration, which played politics. We don't play that way.
It's a simple question. I'm asking you what you meant.
We fight to win, and we ensure the rules of engagements are such that our troops have every authority possible to be.
I'll give you another chance. In saying that, are you trying to tell commanders that that's what you expect? You're in the chain of command. It's a simple question.
I understand that. My commanders know exactly what the guidance is with each and every mission, and they know every tool.
Secretary,
every tool at
in
their disposal
refusing
to be
to answer
effective.
it, I think you speak volumes. I think that's a dangerous thing. We all know the expectations. We know the law of war. We know what is lawful. I'd expect our commanders to understand that as well. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, now.
Here's the revised script with full titles written out. Script: The exchange that left everyone speechless. Host: 30 seconds. 6 American soldiers are dead. Dozens more are wounded. And when Representative Chris Deluzio asked Secretary Pete Hegseth a simple question, Secretary Pete Hegseth couldn't answer it. Watch what happens when Representative Chris Deluzio corners Secretary Pete Hegseth live in front of the entire country. Clip. Play the clip of Representative Chris Deluzio asking Secretary Pete Hegseth whether the troops were liars. Host: 10 minutes. Okay, let's slow this down. Because what you just watched, that exchange between Representative Chris Deluzio and Secretary Pete Hegseth, is one of the most revealing moments we've seen in a congressional hearing in years. And I want to make sure you understand every single layer of it. So here's the backstory. Earlier this year, American troops were stationed in Kuwait. They were in an area near Iran. A drone attack hit them. 6 soldiers died. Dozens were wounded. And after that attack, CBS News went and actually talked to some of those wounded troops. These are real soldiers, real people who were there, real people who got hurt. And here's what they said. They said they were unprepared. They said they had no way to defend themselves. They said they were moved closer to Iran, to an area that was already known to be dangerous, already known to be a target. That's not some reporter guessing. That's not some political spin. That's the soldiers themselves talking. Now here's where it gets interesting. After that CBS report came out, Secretary Pete Hegseth's spokesman, Sean Parnell, went out and said, that's not true. Parnell basically called those soldiers wrong. Some would say Parnell called them liars. So Representative Chris Deluzio walks into that hearing room and goes straight at it. Representative Chris Deluzio asks Secretary Pete Hegseth directly, do you agree with Parnell? Because Parnell is calling these guys liars. Simple question. Yes or no? Secretary Pete Hegseth, do you think those soldiers were lying? And watch what Secretary Pete Hegseth does. Secretary Pete Hegseth doesn't say yes. Secretary Pete Hegseth doesn't say no. Secretary Pete Hegseth says, I don't know if what you're representing is correct or not. I'll take you at your word. Wait. Secretary Pete Hegseth will take Representative Chris Deluzio's word for it? These are direct quotes from CBS News. These are quotes from soldiers who agreed to speak publicly. And Secretary Pete Hegseth says, I'll take your word for it. That tells you something right there. Secretary Pete Hegseth can't even defend his own spokesman's statement. Secretary Pete Hegseth won't call the troops liars directly because he knows how bad that looks. But Secretary Pete Hegseth also won't back down, because that would mean admitting the department got it wrong. So Secretary Pete Hegseth just floats. Then Secretary Pete Hegseth tries to pivot. Secretary Pete Hegseth says, we took every effort possible at the start of this campaign to protect our troops. We moved them off known bases. We put them in places that weren't known targets. We built bunkers. We had air defenses. And Representative Chris Deluzio stops him right there. Representative Chris Deluzio asks, so Secretary Pete Hegseth, you're telling me there is not a single additional thing you could have done? Not one? Because 6 people are dead, and dozens are wounded, and Parnell said every possible measure was taken. Is that really your answer, Secretary Pete Hegseth? And here's where it gets really important, because Secretary Pete Hegseth's answer reveals the actual truth of the situation. Secretary Pete Hegseth says, "We live in a dangerous world, against a determined enemy, and that requires sacrifice and risk. And tragically, 6 Americans lost their lives." Now look, that part is true. War is dangerous. Anyone who has served knows that. Nobody is saying soldiers can never be in harm's way. That's not the argument. The argument is this. If Secretary Pete Hegseth is going to say every possible measure was taken, then Secretary Pete Hegseth needs to be able to back that up. And Representative Chris Deluzio laid it out, plain and simple. Representative Chris Deluzio said, in that location, there were T-walls, basically concrete barriers on the sides. But there was no overhead protection. None. And everyone in that room, everyone watching at home, anyone who has paid attention to the wars in that region knows the primary threat is drone strikes, from above, overhead, and there was nothing protecting those troops from above. So how, exactly, was every possible measure taken, Secretary Pete Hegseth? Secretary Pete Hegseth doesn't have a clean answer to that. Secretary Pete Hegseth just keeps saying, "We did everything possible. We cared. We tried." But Secretary Pete Hegseth caring and trying doesn't change the fact that there was no overhead protection in an area where overhead drone attacks are the #1 threat. That's not a political opinion. That's just what happened. Now, the second part of this hearing, this is where it gets really layered. Representative Chris Deluzio shifts topics. Representative Chris Deluzio turns to General Dan Kane and asks something that sounds simple on the surface. Representative Chris Deluzio says, "General Kane, what would you expect our commanders to do if an enemy lays down their weapons and tries to surrender?" Now, why does Representative Chris Deluzio ask that? Because Secretary Pete Hegseth earlier at a press conference said something very specific. Secretary Pete Hegseth said, "No quarter, no mercy for enemies." Those were Secretary Pete Hegseth's exact words. No quarter, no mercy. Now, if you know military law, if you know international law, if you know what soldiers are trained, you know that no quarter has a very specific meaning. No quarter means you don't take prisoners, you don't accept surrender, you kill everyone, even if they're trying to give up. That is actually a war crime. Under international law, under the laws of armed conflict, you cannot refuse to accept a surrender. You cannot kill someone who is actively trying to lay down their weapons. That is illegal. Full stop. So Representative Chris Deluzio is asking General Kane, what's the expectation? What do our troops do if someone surrenders? And General Kane, who clearly sees where this is going, tries to step back. General Kane says, "Representative Chris Deluzio, I think you're trying to take me to a partisan place. I can't let you do that." Now, Representative Chris Deluzio pushes back gently. Representative Chris Deluzio says, "General Kane, I respect that. I'm not trying to make this partisan. I'm asking a basic question about the law of war." And General Kane basically says, our service members follow lawful orders. There's a checklist. And General Kane leaves it at that. General Kane will not go further. Then Representative Chris Deluzio turns directly to Secretary Pete Hegseth. And Representative Chris Deluzio gives Secretary Pete Hegseth a chance. Representative Chris Deluzio says, "Secretary Pete Hegseth, you said no quarter, no mercy for enemies. I'm giving you a chance to clarify. Are you telling our troops, if a foreign enemy is surrendering, laying down their arms, they should receive no quarter, they should be killed anyway?" And Secretary Pete Hegseth's answer is remarkable. Secretary Pete Hegseth says, "Representative Chris Deluzio, you're trying to take this to a partisan place." Secretary Pete Hegseth attacks the question. Secretary Pete Hegseth doesn't answer it. Secretary Pete Hegseth says, "That was the previous administration that played politics. We don't do that." Representative Chris Deluzio says, "Secretary Pete Hegseth, I'm asking a simple question. Yes or no? Is that what you expect of commanders? And Secretary Pete Hegseth says, my commanders know exactly what the guidance is with each and every mission. They know every tool available to them. That's not an answer. That's Secretary Pete Hegseth deflecting. Secretary Pete Hegseth literally just said, they know the guidance. But what is the guidance, Secretary Pete Hegseth? Secretary Pete Hegseth won't say. Secretary Pete Hegseth used his own words, no quarter, no mercy, in a public press conference. And then, when Representative Chris Deluzio asks directly what those words mean, Secretary Pete Hegseth says, my commanders know what to do. Think about what that means for a second. Secretary Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, goes on camera, says no quarter, no mercy, and then refuses to clarify to Representative Chris Deluzio whether that means soldiers should kill people who are surrendering. If Secretary Pete Hegseth's answer is no, of course we follow the law of war. Why won't Secretary Pete Hegseth just say that? It takes 5 seconds. Secretary Pete Hegseth could say, I expect our troops to follow the laws of armed conflict. Done. Secretary Pete Hegseth won't say it. And that's the moment Representative Chris Deluzio points to. Representative Chris Deluzio says, Secretary Pete Hegseth, I think you speak volumes. Because Secretary Pete Hegseth not answering that question tells you something. Maybe Secretary Pete Hegseth knows that no quarter, no mercy was a bad thing to say. Maybe Secretary Pete Hegseth is trying to protect himself from the political fallout. Maybe Secretary Pete Hegseth genuinely doesn't want to walk back tough-sounding language. Whatever the reason, Secretary Pete Hegseth won't clarify it. So let's bring this all together. In this one hearing, 2 very important things happened. First, Representative Chris Deluzio showed that Secretary Pete Hegseth's claim that every possible measure was taken to protect troops doesn't hold up. The troops themselves said they were unprepared. There was no overhead protection in an area known for drone attacks. 6 people are dead. And Secretary Pete Hegseth's answer is, we did everything we could. Second, Secretary Pete Hegseth went on record saying no quarter, no mercy, and then absolutely refused to clarify what he meant when Representative Chris Deluzio asked directly whether that applies to surrendering enemies. Now here's what I want you to take from this. This isn't about Republican or Democrat. This isn't about being for or against the military. This is about basic accountability. When soldiers die, when soldiers are wounded, Secretary Pete Hegseth should be able to answer Representative Chris Deluzio's questions. When Secretary Pete Hegseth uses language that could be interpreted as ordering illegal actions, Secretary Pete Hegseth should be able to clarify what he meant. These aren't trick questions from Representative Chris Deluzio. These aren't partisan traps. These are the most basic questions you can ask Secretary Pete Hegseth in that position. And when Secretary Pete Hegseth can't answer them, or won't answer them, that tells you something very important. The families of those 6 soldiers deserve answers. The dozens of wounded troops deserve answers. And the American people, who pay for this military, who send their sons and daughters to serve, deserve answers too. What Representative Chris Deluzio did in that room was simple. Representative Chris Deluzio asked the questions. Representative Chris Deluzio kept asking them. And Secretary Pete Hegseth kept not answering. And sometimes, that silence says more than any answer could.